In this episode, we move into one of the most important parts of the audit process, because no audit conclusion matters very much unless it is supported by solid evidence. A learner preparing for the Certified Information Systems Auditor (CISA) exam needs to understand that evidence is not just paperwork collected to fill a folder or satisfy a formal requirement. It is the factual foundation that allows an auditor to say that a control is working, a process is weak, a risk is not being managed well, or a reported condition needs management attention. Without evidence, an audit becomes opinion. An opinion is not enough when leaders need assurance about systems, processes, and business risk. As we work through this topic, keep one basic idea in mind. Collecting evidence is not about gathering the largest possible pile of material. It is about gathering the right material from the right sources in a way that allows the auditor to support conclusions clearly, fairly, and credibly. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first thing to understand is what audit evidence actually is in practical terms. Evidence is any information the auditor uses to assess whether a process, control, or condition matches what should be happening. That information can come from documents, system records, interviews, observation, physical inspection, reports, or the auditor's own testing of how something works. A policy document may show what management intended, an approval record may show what was actually authorized, a system log may show what activity occurred, and an observed walkthrough may show what people really do in daily practice. Each of these gives the auditor a different angle on reality, and good evidence collection often depends on combining those angles rather than trusting one source by itself. Beginners sometimes assume that evidence means only written documents, but that is too narrow. Audit evidence is broader than paper because the real objective is to understand what exists, what happened, and whether the facts support the conclusion the auditor is preparing to report. A second major idea is that evidence has to be both sufficient and appropriate. Sufficiency refers to how much evidence the auditor has gathered, while appropriateness refers to whether that evidence is relevant and reliable enough to support the conclusion. These two ideas work together, and that matters because a large amount of weak evidence does not automatically become strong evidence just because there is more of it. 10 copies of the same incomplete report may still leave critical questions unanswered, while a smaller set of highly reliable records may be far more persuasive. Relevance also matters because evidence should directly connect to the audit objective instead of merely sounding related. If the audit question is whether access approvals were obtained before system access was granted, then general training records about security awareness do not answer that question well, even if they are real documents. A good auditor keeps asking whether the evidence is enough, whether it addresses the actual issue, and whether it comes from a source strong enough to deserve confidence. Document inspection is one of the most common evidence collection techniques, and it is often where auditors begin because organizations typically describe their intentions and activities through records. Policies, procedures, standards, diagrams, tickets, approval histories, change records, incident records, contracts, reconciliations, meeting notes, and exception reports can all reveal how the organization says work should be done and how that work was documented in practice. This technique is powerful because documents create a trace that can often be reviewed later, compared across time, and linked directly to decisions or events. At the same time, document inspection has limits because a record may be incomplete, outdated, copied forward from an older process, or created after the fact to appear compliant. That is why auditors should not treat every document as automatically trustworthy. A procedure may describe a strong approval process, yet the actual approval records may show delays, missing signatures, or evidence that the review was purely routine. Document inspection is useful, but it works best when the auditor reads critically and asks whether the record reflects real performance or only formal intent. Inquiry and interviews are another important evidence collection technique because many parts of a process cannot be understood fully from documents alone. People often know where work slows down, where exceptions occur, which controls are viewed as important, and where unofficial workarounds have developed over time. By speaking with process owners, managers, system administrators, and staff who perform the daily work, the auditor can learn how the process truly operates and where the greatest risks may exist. Interviews are especially helpful early in an audit because they allow the auditor to build context, identify useful records, and notice gaps between written procedures and real practice. Still, inquiry is usually considered less reliable than direct documentary or system-based evidence if it stands alone, because people may forget details, misunderstand their own role, describe the ideal process instead of the real one, or present the situation in the best possible light. For that reason, good auditors use interviews to guide evidence collection, clarify what they see, and identify areas for further testing rather than treating conversation by itself as the final proof. Observation is a technique that becomes especially valuable when an auditor needs to understand how a process unfolds in real time. Watching a user request access, observing how a supervisor reviews an exception report, or following a walkthrough of a change approval process can reveal details that written records fail to capture. Observation may show whether controls happen at the point they are supposed to happen, whether people rely on memory instead of structured review, and whether the actual workflow matches the official description. This technique is powerful because it allows the auditor to see timing, sequence, behavior, and handoffs directly rather than reconstructing them later from records that may omit important context. Yet observation also has limitations that beginners should remember. People often behave more carefully when they know they are being watched, and a process that looks orderly during one observed instance may not operate that way every day. That means observation is highly useful, but it should usually be combined with documentation, interviews, and other evidence so the auditor can judge whether what was seen represents normal practice or only a temporary best-case performance. Reperformance is one of the strongest evidence collection techniques because it involves the auditor independently checking whether a control or process produces the expected result. Instead of merely asking whether a reconciliation was performed, the auditor may repeat the reconciliation on a selected item or set of items to see whether the process leads to the same answer. Instead of trusting that an access review was meaningful, the auditor may examine a chosen access case and trace whether approvals, role assignment, and removal steps were handled correctly. This approach is powerful because it reduces dependence on what someone says happened and allows the auditor to validate a result directly. In some situations, the auditor may also perform recalculation, such as verifying that totals, balances, or exception thresholds were computed correctly. Reperformance can take more time than simple inspection, which is why it is usually targeted to important controls or areas of uncertainty. Still, when used carefully, it provides especially persuasive support because it shows not just that a record exists, but that the underlying process can actually produce accurate and reliable outcomes. System-generated information has become a major source of audit evidence because so many important processes are now recorded through applications, workflow tools, access management systems, and automated logs. Reports showing access approvals, change implementations, backup results, user activity, or exception handling can help auditors understand large populations of activity much more efficiently than manual review alone. These records are often valuable because they capture events at scale and may include timestamps, user identifiers, and processing details that help reconstruct what happened. However, there is an important caution here. Auditors should think about the reliability of system-generated evidence rather than assuming that because a system produced a report, the report must be correct. If report logic is poorly designed, if underlying data is incomplete, or if access to modify records is not well controlled, then the evidence may be weaker than it first appears. Good collection technique, therefore, includes understanding where the report came from, what it includes, whether it covers the full population needed, and whether the surrounding controls make it reasonable to rely on that information. External evidence is often considered highly persuasive because it comes from outside the immediate control of the area being audited. A vendor agreement, an external confirmation, an independent service report, or a customer-facing contractual obligation may help the auditor understand requirements, obligations, and conditions that internal staff cannot simply rewrite to suit the moment. For example, if management claims a third party performs a control reliably, external records or confirmations may help validate that claim better than internal assurances alone. This does not mean external evidence is always perfect, because outside information can still be misunderstood, outdated, or incomplete. Still, evidence from an independent source often carries added weight, because it is less likely to have been shaped by the same incentives or blind spots affecting the internal process. For a beginner, the important lesson is that evidence strength often increases when the source is more independent from the condition being tested. Auditors therefore value opportunities to compare internal claims against outside records whenever the audit objective makes that possible and worthwhile. A very important evidence collection habit is corroboration, which simply means checking whether different sources tell the same story. If a policy says access must be approved by a manager, an interview says that happens for every request, and the selected request records all show timely approval before provisioning, the evidence begins to reinforce itself. If those sources disagree, that disagreement matters just as much as the agreement would have mattered. Perhaps the policy is outdated, the person interviewed misunderstood the process, or the records reveal a control gap management had not recognized clearly. Corroboration is valuable because it helps reduce the chance that the auditor will be misled by any one weak or incomplete source. It also improves judgment by showing where evidence aligns and where additional collection is needed. Strong auditors do not become attached to the first explanation they hear. They keep comparing sources until the facts make sense together or until the inconsistency itself becomes an issue that deserves testing, escalation, or possible reporting. Another technique that matters greatly is tracing and vouching, even if learners do not always hear those words emphasized early. Tracing generally means following a transaction or event forward from its source to later records or outcomes, while vouching often means moving backward from a recorded item to the supporting source documentation. These movements help answer different kinds of questions. If the auditor wants to know whether all approved changes were actually implemented in a controlled way, tracing from approval to implementation records may help. If the auditor wants to know whether a recorded payment was legitimate, vouching from the payment entry back to invoices, approvals, and receiving evidence may be more useful. This forward and backward discipline matters because some risks involve omission, while others involve invalid activity being recorded as if it were proper. Evidence collection becomes stronger when the auditor chooses the direction that best matches the concern. Rather than staring at one document in isolation, tracing and vouching help build a story about how the event moved through the process. Evidence collection also depends heavily on timing and preservation, because evidence is most valuable when it reflects the period under review and remains available in a form the auditor can examine properly. Some system logs may be retained only for a short time. Some reports may change each time they are generated. Some approvals may exist in email 1 month and be hard to locate later if retention practices are weak. That means auditors need to think early about when important evidence must be captured and how they will preserve enough of it in the work papers to support later review. Timing also matters because a control that appears to exist today may not have existed earlier in the audit period, and a report produced after the fact may not be as persuasive as a contemporaneous record created during normal operations. Beginners sometimes underestimate this point and assume evidence will always be easy to retrieve later. In reality, good collection technique often includes acting promptly, documenting sources carefully, and preserving enough context that another reviewer can understand what the auditor obtained, when it was obtained, and why it supports the conclusion. A common challenge in evidence collection is dealing with evidence that is incomplete, conflicting, or of uncertain quality. This is where audit judgment becomes especially important. If one record suggests a control was performed, but another record shows a date inconsistency or a missing approval, the auditor should not simply choose the easier interpretation and move on. More evidence may be needed. Interviews may need to be revisited, or the sample may need to be expanded to determine whether the issue is isolated or part of a larger weakness. Similarly, if the organization cannot provide records for key activities, that absence is not just an inconvenience. In some cases, it may itself be evidence of poor control design, weak retention practices, or unreliable oversight. The auditor's job is not to force certainty where certainty is unavailable. The job is to gather enough dependable information to form a supportable conclusion and to be honest about limitations when the evidence does not allow a stronger statement. A practical example can tie these techniques together. Imagine an audit reviewing whether terminated employees had their access removed promptly from a sensitive business application. The auditor might begin with interviews to understand how termination notices are supposed to flow from management to the access administration team. Next, document inspection could be used to review the formal procedure, selected termination records, and account removal evidence. System-generated records might then provide date and time details showing when the account was actually disabled, while observation of the process may reveal whether notifications are manual, automated, delayed, or dependent on one individual remembering to act. If inconsistencies appear, the auditor could reperform the timing comparison on selected cases to test whether removal occurred within policy requirements. By combining inquiry, document review, system data, observation, and independent checking, the auditor builds a stronger conclusion than any one technique could provide alone. That example shows why evidence collection is less about one favorite method and more about assembling a reliable picture from several well-chosen sources. As we close, the most important lesson is that audit evidence collection is a disciplined search for facts that can support sound judgment. Documents, interviews, observation, reperformance, system records, external sources, tracing, vouching, and corroboration all play different roles, and a strong auditor learns when each technique is most useful and what its limitations may be. The real skill lies in collecting evidence that is sufficient, appropriate, relevant, and reliable enough to support conclusions without wasting effort on material that does not answer the audit question. For a CISA learner, this topic matters because evidence is what turns audit work from conversation into assurance. When evidence collection is thoughtful and well executed, the auditor can explain not only what was found, but why the finding is credible, how it was supported, and where the organization needs to improve control, accountability, or process discipline.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.